from the Institute for the Advancement of Cognitive Education. These are powerful podcasts, conversations with scholars, authors, and professionals, cutting-edge resources, helping you to enhance better thinking and learning.
Good day. Our guest today is Estelle Brettenny. She's an occupational therapist with more than 40 years of clinical experience. She's also a certified trainer in cognitive enrichment advantage since 1997 and in thinking maps since 2011. She's got extensive experience in cognitive education training for educators and professionals. And she was also part of the board of the International Association for Cognitive Education, IASESA, for 2 decades, and also served as president from 2013 to 2015. She's a founding member of Thinking School South Africa, and she's currently also an honorary member of the Institute for the Advancement of Cognitive Education. Estelle, you are so welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice being here.
Estelle, today we're going to talk about self-regulated learning. What is self-regulated learning and how can it enhance better thinking and learning?
Yeah, I think the concept self-regulated learning is not always very well known, but it's an essential key component to move from superficial learning to deeper learning and learner autonomy. The concepts of self-regulated learning and learner autonomy have attracted a lot of attention in the past 2 or 3 decades from numerous academic scholars, and there are different theories or schools of thought to explain why some learners are more successful than others. And I think self-regulated learning is essential to move towards more academic success. So one of the well-recognized researchers and academic scholars that writes a lot about self-regulated learning is Zimmerman, and he outlines 3 key features that forms part of the definitions of self-regulated learning. So the first one that often you find in literature is the systematic use of metacognitive, motivational, and behavior strategies. And then the second part is the self-orientated feedback loop in which students monitor the effectiveness of their learning methods and strategies. And this, I find, for example, is a very important component that's often lacking in students and learners. And then the third component is how and why students choose a specific strategy. So that's to do with the motivation to self-regulate. So that in a nutshell is more or less what it entails.
Right. So, Estelle, there might be some terms that some of our listeners might not be familiar with. And I think one of it in the first point of Zimmerman, you indicated that the systematic use of metacognitive and motivational and behavioral strategies is number one. But what is metacognition? If you can just maybe explain that in a nutshell.
Okay. So metacognition very simply refers to thinking about thinking, but it's actually more complex than that. So if one thinks a little bit more about it, it refers to one's own knowledge of what one does know and does not know. So it's the ability to understand and control one's own cognitive processes and performances. So then one can ask again, what's cognitive processes and performance? And I'll come back to that now. So metacognition involves the use of prior knowledge to plan a strategy for approaching a learning task, to take action, to reflect, to evaluate results, and to make changes when needed. So often it's said there can't be metacognition without cognition. And cognition refers to the way we take information in from the environment, and then there's perception. So perception is a cognitive process, for example. But if a lot of stimuli comes in and we need to kind of decide what to focus on, we need to pay attention. So attention is a cognitive process. And then we might have to pull something from memory to help us make a decision. So memory is a cognitive process. So when we talk about metacognition, it means we've got to think about our attention. We've got to think about our memory and various other cognitive processes that we might be using or need to use at that point. So it's a complex process that requires learners to really be taught how to think about their own thinking in order to reflect about their own thinking and to evaluate what they're doing and then to make changes. I always say metacognition is like the magic that makes learning really meaningful and effective.
And I think, something important that you highlight is the fact that it can be taught. People can learn this to raise metacognition and all these strategies.
Yes, no, that's very important. And I think that is why in my involvement over the years with ICSA, the International Association for Cognitive Education, where we really spent a lot of time also helping educators and parents and professionals to understand the whole notion of cognition and why it's so important to develop thinking skills in learners, because you can't even expect them to have metacognition if they don't even understand how to think and what are meant by thinking processes and different cognitive skills. So, yeah, it is a very complex process to teach children, but it's possible.
Estelle, regarding metacognition and self-regulated learning, what are some of the biggest challenges that parents and teachers and practitioners might face?
I think based on my experience and work with learners, parents, educators, and professionals, I feel that a lot of people are not always aware or really knowledgeable about the deeper meaning of self-regulated learning or how to empower learners practically to become more self-regulated. I always say that if you don't know how to recognize something, or if you are not self-regulated or a self-regulated learner yourself, you cannot successfully help others to become more self-regulated. So I think that is the first dilemma for me, that everyone is not really knowledgeable about this concept. And then the other dilemma that I've experienced over more than 2 decades is that more and more learners are receiving extra lessons, have tutors, take medication, or they receive therapies or various kinds of interventions. And I've really witnessed the exponential growth in the tutoring industry over the past 20 years. So parents are desperately seeking help to help their children, but often they rely on methods that makes the children more passive in a certain way. So that takes away the opportunity for the learners to become self-regulated. So that for me is a huge problem. And I'm often really inundated with referrals of parents that seek help, but often they have done too much for too long for their children, and then they say, but now we can't anymore. So they've helped the children, for example, learning and making summaries and basically doing the things for the children, staying up very late in the evening. And then they get to a point when the children get to grade 5 or 6, and then they feel we just can't keep up anymore. And then they want the children to become independent, but the children are so dependent on the parents often that it's very difficult for them then to move on their own and to do these things on their own. So in the process, the children then have developed bad habits of thinking and learning, and often it wasn't intentional of the parents, but then they want skills for the children. And often the parents then feel, but we don't know how to go about things, or they're not 100% up to date with all the different subjects, and then they start seeking help, for the children. So that's a huge problem that I experience daily.
And if I understand you correctly, it's not wrong in itself to receive tutoring and help, but all of those interventions must lead to a point where a learner becomes autonomous and self-regulated in his or her learning.
That's right, because often the children are too dependent on the extra help. So they will actually not utilize the classroom opportunity optimally because they think, I'm going to my tutor afterwards, or I'll see the tutor to help me. And then they actually don't use what the teachers are doing in the class optimally and rely on the tutor to basically reteach the work to them or to explain the work to them again or to help them with the homework, instead of becoming metacognitive and thinking about what they need to do and how they need to do it and regulating themselves to get involved with the work. I did not mention earlier on, and I maybe just want to go back to that one point, that when we spoke about metacognition, and maybe we can talk about that again, but there's actually two important components of the metacognition. So it's the metacognitive knowledge and the metacognitive regulation. So I don't know if I can say something more about that now. Or,
I think it's important. I think you should explain a little bit more about that.
Okay, so researchers refer to these two dimensions. So the first dimension is the metacognitive knowledge. That is then the knowledge of cognition, but it includes three aspects. It's knowledge of yourself as a learner, that's your strengths, your weaknesses, or awareness of factors that can affect your learning. And then there's the knowledge of cognitive strategies and the knowledge of the cognitive demands of a task. So often that knowledge is not even 100% there. And then the next part is the metacognitive regulation. So the metacognitive regulation includes three phases. And this is where I often see that learners lack the three phases. They don't spend time planning exactly what they must learn, where they must learn it, how they must learn it, when, with whom, etc. And then the monitoring phase, to monitor and control what they've planned while they are doing it, is not always happening. And then the evaluation phase is when you've done something to evaluate yourself in your own learning, to say what went well and what did not go well and what should I do next time. So unfortunately, these skills, it's not always addressed during a tutoring session, for example. So the learner will go into a more passive situation and receive information, but not always get the opportunity to really reflect about strategies they can use and then monitor the use of these strategies. So it's vital for a lot of children to have extra interventions, but the self-regulated learning needs very specific inputs and training to develop those skills.
Thank you, Estelle. And maybe some of the listeners might feel a bit overwhelmed with all of the information and the complexity thereof. And let me just mention that we're also going to post Estelle's blog information on the website, and there will also be contact details if some of the listeners want to make contact with you. So, Estelle, what are recommended ways to develop self-regulated learning?
Yeah, one document that I looked at recently was called the Guidance Report on Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning. That was a document compiled by the Education Endowment Foundation. And they very nicely outlined 7 recommendations that can be used by primary and secondary schools, and I think beyond that. The first 2 recommendations for me is crucial. And the one is that teachers, and then one can add parents, practitioners, etc., should acquire the professional understanding and skills to develop learners' metacognitive knowledge. So that's the first recommendation. And then the second one is that teachers, and one can again add practitioners or parents, must teach learners explicitly metacognitive strategies, including how to plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. So those 2 recommendations can happen in a big way in a classroom situation even, because teachers are in a prime situation to help learners to develop metacognitive strategies and to help them to monitor the use of those strategies and to make it explicit if they're aware of this and if they understand the concepts. Yes. So that definitely is sort of like the starting point. Yeah, and then in my work as a practitioner, where I work with children on a daily basis in a mainstream high school and also as a private occupational therapist, I often develop visual resources to make it easier for me to mediate and explain and teach some of these difficult concepts to the people that I work with, or to help parents to understand it. And I've also developed a visual aid around the concepts of metacognition and self-regulated learning that will be in the blog that will be posted on the website.
I looked at the visual that you've included in the blog post. I think it's extremely helpful and very thorough. So thank you very much for your generosity also to share that with the learners.
I don't know if there's time to talk a little bit about that.
I think if you want to briefly touch on that, it might be helpful, yes.
Okay, so maybe I can just, based on the visual, just give a quick overview. But on the visual, because often I find learners have, say, a daunting task, and I've been dealing with learners, say, for example, this week that had an English literature test on Animal Farm. Now, on the left-hand side of the poster are images of two learners and the faces. And I always ask the children, so how do you feel about this? Let's, for example, say literature essay that you need to do for the test. Are you feeling challenged? Or are you feeling confident? To help them to have that knowledge about themselves and how they view this task that they need to do. So that's on the left-hand side, the two learner faces. On the right-hand side is a little image of a task, and then I would explain to them that this is the task that you need to now do and face, but you need to have knowledge of these tasks. So say, for example, it's a literature essay, you need to know exactly what is expected from me in a literature essay, and what is the strategies that I need to implement. And for example, a literature essay, the teachers might have taught the children a strategy that they call the SEAL method, and the SEEL stands for certain steps that they need to follow and implement in the paragraphs to make a statement, to give evidence and examples, to explain the evidence, and then to link with the next paragraph. Now, that is a very, very specific strategy that the teachers, for example, teach the learners. So if you look on the bottom side of the visual resource, we can see the three arrows that says knowledge of yourself as a learner, knowledge of strategies, and knowledge of the task. And this is exactly what I just highlighted now. They can use the SEAL method as a strategy, a cognitive strategy, to help them with the cognitive demands of that task. That's very challenging. And if they do this in their preparation and they deliberately put themselves into that white space on the poster that refers to the learning pit, it means they're challenging themselves to think, how am I going to use these strategies to prepare for my essay and to develop my skills to be able to do that effectively. So often learners land in the learning pit. That's a concept that was developed by James Nottingham, in which he refers to this space where a learner might be challenged, but it's a good space to be in. And often learners, to avoid that space, they don't want to go into the learning pit where they feel challenged, but that is where you really grow and become a more effective learner and a self-regulated learner. So if a learner then implements the strategies while they're preparing, they've got to regulate the implementation. And that is why on the top of the poster, I've indicated the metacognitive regulation part. So they've got to do some planning of how I will do this task, exactly what strategies I'm going to use. And then while they are doing that, they need to monitor themselves to make dead sure they're implementing, for example, the SEAL method correctly. They follow the structure that the teachers recommended, and that would be marked in the test and according to the rubric. And then after they've done that, they've got to evaluate themselves to say, did I do what I'm supposed to do? Will I be able to achieve my goal in terms of what is expected of me in the test? So I often sit with children in a session, and then it just comes up automatically, the challenge that they need to deal with. And then I'll take them to the poster and I'll show them how everything that is happening is actually connected to some part of the poster. And it really helps children to understand the process that they're actually busy going through. And that's a vital part of the learning process that they need to do.
Estelle, thank you very much. I think this is an extremely helpful tool. I've got it opened in front of me right now, and I really want to encourage the listeners to visit our website, to read your blog post, and to look at the poster. And if they want to engage with you further on that, to reach out to you and to engage further on the post. I think it's extremely helpful, and I think it can really help learners to strategize around learning cognition and metacognition. Right. Estelle, just very briefly, what are some of the important signs that will indicate to parents and teachers, practitioners, that learners are becoming more self-regulated?
Yes, I think self-regulated learners are definitely self-starters. They are normally more confident, strategic, and resourceful, and self-reactive to task performance. They will definitely be more goal-orientated and know what they're working towards, and they know when they have the knowledge or possess a skill and when they don't. Learners that's not yet self-regulated often don't know what they don't know. They think things are going okay and they're going to be prepared for a task or a test when in actual fact they're not. So self-regulated learners seek out information when required and they take deliberate steps to master it. And they will find ways to succeed despite obstacles or poor conditions. And that's also a very strong characteristic of self-regulated learners. They often will use strategies to organize the surroundings or the environment to make it possible for them to do what they need to do. Whereas learners that are not yet self-regulated will use it as an excuse and say, I couldn't do my learning because of X, Y, Z. Where self-regulated learners will deal with those challenges. So they also view learning as a systematic and controlled process and take greater responsibility for the achievement outcomes. So they're definitely more proactive and they benefit also more than from learning activities. So in general, self-regulated learners will demonstrate metacognitive skills, they will be more motivated and behaviorally more active participants in their own learning. And obviously that will lead to greater results. That will also then be a positive cycle of reinforcing them to become even more self-regulated.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think all of this is very helpful and will be very helpful to our listeners. On your blog post, Estelle, you've also listed a number of applicable literature sources on metacognition and self-regulated learning, as well as tools on the topic of metacognition and self-regulated learning. So I would really encourage the listeners to visit your blog post that we will put on our website. Last question, where can our listeners get hold of you if they want to engage further?
Yes, they can email me. My name is Estelle, Estelle at Brettenny, my surname, BRETTENY.co.za, or they can visit my website, but the details they can find on the blog post, just www.brettenny.co.za. They can get hold of me or my cell phone number 082-430-7956.
And for our international listeners, that would just be a +27. So that would be the incoming code in South Africa. Thank you very much. I think this is an extremely important topic that we've covered today. Thank you for your generous sharing of information, also the tools that you've developed in your own practice that you availed to our listeners. And I really want to thank you for the valuable contribution that you've made.
Thank you. It was nice being here, and thanks for the opportunity.
This podcast is produced by the Institute for the Advancement of Cognitive Education. Find us online at www.ilearnthinking.org or on social media at iLearnThinking.